This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the easy and reliable way to build a website for yourself or your business. Use my code POTENTIALHISTORY for 10% off your first Squarespace order. Oh, it's a pencil that looks like it could have been produced in the Soviet Union. Oh yeah, another facecam video. I'm sure this was what you wanted. Believe it or not, there's a finite amount of footage of a weird test tank that only flew once, supposedly, so figured this was the best way to go. That, and I'm starting to reuse footage over and over again because there's only so much. The invention of the parachute predates the airplane by quite a bit, but once the airplane was around, it really made the parachute kind of come into its own as a practical thing. Previously, you would jump off a cliff or something and use the parachute, and it'd be kind of fun. Now it had an actual practical purpose for if you needed to jump out of an airplane and get to the ground, or more than likely, your plane's getting shot down and you want an alternative to just crashing with it. And militaries all across the world, once air combat became a thing, really embraced it and thought it was a great invention that they could use to save their pilots' lives. But as militaries do whenever there's new technology, or in this case, old technology that now has a real purpose, they take a look at it and think, this is great, but how can we kill people with it? Then a few things happen, fast forward a few decades, and you got an HBO greatest hit show. But all jokes aside, in the interwar era, you do see the major powers begin to raise their own airborne divisions. The idea being that these troops, strapped down with as much equipment as possible to be as self-reliant as they can be, will jump into enemy-occupied territory, cause chaos behind the lines, and help the front line move forward and make their targets just a little bit easier to pass through. The big problem is these are light infantry by pretty much every standard. They can only jump in with anything that they can carry. So what happens when their little pussy bullets run into armored cars, tanks, things like that they can't shoot through? They're pretty much hosed. So ideas were brought forward very quickly on how to get heavier weapons to these guys so that they could be more effective in the field. Namely, tanks. Now just about every major power outside of, I think, Japan attempted to do this, just some way to get a tank onto the battlefield with airborne forces. So even though I'm beating up on the Soviet Union today, there's plenty of examples from every other country. It was in the 1930s that the Soviets began testing their first ideas of airborne tanks. This included either dropping a tank with a larger parachute and its crew separately onto the battlefield, using a T-27, or just strapping the T-27 underneath a bomber and dropping it from a lower altitude, which apparently, as long as the gearbox was in neutral, would work and the tank wouldn't fall apart on impact. That seems a little counterintuitive to me, but apparently it was successful. The only problem is that you're dropping the tank by itself without its crew, so the crew then has to go and find the tank, jump in it, and begin fighting in it. So there could be quite a bit of delay between when the crew hits the ground and when the tank actually starts fighting, kind of negating the quickness and the overall goal of paradropping a tank into a hot fire zone. There are also other factors that you couldn't plan for, like wind. Maybe the tank blows in this direction, the crew blows in this direction, then you've accidentally handed the enemy a tank to use. Just all kinds of problems. But in the early 40s, a designer named Oleg Antonov seemed to have come up with an answer to this question. He proposed taking a T-60 tank and attaching it to a sort of glider contraption that would be pulled behind a bomber that would slowly glide down to the earth, land, automatically detach its wings, and then go straight into combat, eliminating all the other problems previously seen. And this was his design, the Antonov A-40. Now, some of the sources vary around this thing. From what I can tell, there's only one, maybe two prototypes made, and one of the aspects to it was they had to remove parts from the tank to make it as light as possible to get it airborne. Even though it's a light tank, it's still significantly heavy, and it's not going to have a good time flying because it's not designed for that. Some sources suggest that the gun and all the ammunition were taken off. That seems kind of counterintuitive to me for what its intended role was, to just roll onto the battlefield and start fighting. Other sources claim that armor was reduced, along with taking everything off that they could, headlights, reducing the number of fluids, things like that. Anyways, in his design, he was able to lighten it enough to basically get it to where it could glide and be airborne for a little bit of time. And the idea for use for this was twofold. It could either be used with Soviet airborne troops dropped in with them, like I said before. The second use, though, which I actually think is pretty cool, was that it could be dropped behind the lines to friendly partisan units. When it was dropped with the partisans, it could be dropped with more ammunition and more fuel to where they could make great use of it, wreaking havoc behind the German lines. That is, if they could get the whole thing to work. The official story of the first test flight goes like this. A veteran test pilot named Sergei Anakin was chosen to do the testing, and he was given a quick crash course on how to drive a tank beforehand, because the contraption, pretty ingeniously, used the traversing of the turret to control the pitch of the wings. So, in theory, a tank commander or a tank driver would be able to learn how to fly this thing pretty quickly. The A-40 was towed into its first flight by a Tupolev TB-3 bomber that pretty quickly after it got into the air began to have its engines overheat. This was obviously due to the extra weight of the tank, and because of that, they had to jettison the contraption long before they were supposed to. Anakin, though, being the experienced test pilot that he was able to jump into action and safely get the thing down to the ground in a successful first test flight. He even drove the vehicle back to the testing area, where he and all the other designers on the project, very excited, patted each other on the back and celebrated what was a successful first flight in something that may become a very big war-winning tool. However, after this, though, the project was canceled, and there's a couple reasons why. The Soviets had a very limited number of these bombers that were capable of dropping these aircraft into combat zones. And even the ones that were capable apparently were having trouble, as shown in the first test flight. It was decided that they were probably better used in their primary role of bombing, rather than towing T-60s into combat. The T-60 that in and of itself was not a very potent tank at this point in the war. It was quickly becoming outclassed by other vehicles, and along with the fact that most of its ammunition and fuel had to be dropped separately, sort of defeating the purpose of it immediately rolling into action, in that it could only do it for a short period of time before it needed to be resupplied, the whole thing was kind of scrapped. And on top of this, because it is an official story, it is sort of dubious as to if this was actually what went down. When I was doing the research for this video, everything that I came across pointed back to this one official release story. And all the details were exactly the same, everything was in lockstep, and because of that, it kind of makes it so that you don't trust it 100%, that maybe something went wrong with the actual test flight, and this was what was released is what happened to kind of save face. I don't have anything to back that up, but everything's just so perfect, and all the details are the exact same wherever I read it, that could be the case, and possibly the first flight wasn't as successful as is said, and this was the story that was released to make it look better. Couple this with the fact that the photo that is often shown of the A-40 in flight is actually a concept drawing by the designer, the whole thing may not be what it's said to be. Either way, at least for me, this is easily the most successful and the best idea of all the airborne tank designs that were put forth by any country during the war. I mean, compare this with something like the Locust, that had to be strapped underneath a large plane, landed at an airfield, and then had to have its turret put on top of it before it could go into action. That is far from the idea of dropping a tank in to help paratroopers, because the paratroopers are going to have to capture the place that the tank is going to be landed at, kind of defeating the purpose of it. In that case, it might as well be easier to just drop in an area, secure it, and wait for the relief troops that you're jumping ahead of to come and support you with better tanks. So even though this didn't get past the testing stage, it was a really good attempt and a really good idea. And it ended up not being the end of Soviet airborne tank design ideas, because later on in the Cold War they did successfully figure out how to air deploy a BMP. Thank you to everyone for watching. I apologize for the shorter video and the weird format. Halfway through this past month I got sick and lost a whole week of work, and I've been doing a lot of sponsorships on videos to try to save up extra money to get to Tank Fest this summer, and so I've really been playing catch up these past few weeks, so that's with the weird upload schedule and for the shorter video today. But this tank has been requested for a long time, and once again, Tank Files being a really good series for weird one-offs like this, I thought I'd take the opportunity to do it now. Huge thanks to our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to build and manage your business, side projects, brands, or anything else you could think of to set up an online presence for. It's incredibly user-friendly and strives to help you create a totally personalized website as you're setting it up. Choose from a wide variety of award-winning templates and scour through endless customization options, so you can totally tailor the website to exactly what you want. I'm actually in the process of setting up my own website, release to be announced, and was playing around with all the different customization options on the Bedford template. The level of detail is pretty good. They have really great interfaces for using Squarespace for your business, and great inventory and sales management, as well as 24-hour customer service. They've also just been really awesome to work with, and really seem to be a for-the-customer company. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/potentialhistory and add code potentialhistory at checkout to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Also, a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon for making these videos possible, especially for putting up with my terrible schedule and lack of interactiveness overall this past month. Some definite revisions to my schedule will be made in the future to avoid scenarios like this. but they've kept with me and I can't thank them enough for that. As always, thank you for watching and I'll see you on the next one.